As we enter into the Christmas season, I think it is a good time to talk about stories, to describe sort of pastorally where we are, where the Senate is. So I have a story today I'd like to tell you about how the Senate works or doesn't work. And so it came to pass that the filibuster was dismembered, dishonored, and indefinitely detained. With the end of the filibuster came the end of any semblance of comity and compromise on Capitol Hill. The party that never cared much for the rule of law broke the rules of the Senate to change the rules. Senate rules for nearly 2 centuries allowed the filibuster. The filibuster was simply a requirement that 60% of senators must approve nominations and legislation. This supermajority requirement actually fostered more centrist solutions and compromises. In order to change the rules, though, and kill the filibuster, it required a 2/3 majority to change the rules. However, the party that doesn't and hasn't concerned themselves with the rule of law simply broke the rules. When the chair said that's against the rules, they said, we don't care if it's against the rules. The rules are whatever we say the rules are. The best way to put this in perspective, you're watching a tennis match. The ball is clearly a foot out of bounds. The umpire says out of bounds. Instead of going by the rules, you have everyone vote. So the audience at Wimbledon votes that it was in bounds when it was really out of bounds. That's what we have here. We have no more rules. And we have no more comity. We have no more compromise. What we have is poison. Poison that's been given to us by people who have no concern for the rules. Historically, this has always required 2/3 of Congress to change the rules, 2/3 of the Senate. But for the first time, we break the rules to change the rules. So in the parliamentarian rules to Senate Democrats, that you're breaking the rules, they say, no, it really wasn't out of bounds, it was in bounds. Or we don't care that it was out of bounds, we don't care what the rules say, we went our way. We're impatient. We want our nominations and we want them now. We don't care about the history of the Senate. We don't care about the history of the Congress. We want our way or we will pick up our toys and we will go home. We want it now. We want it now. We want all of it. We don't want to talk with the other side. We don't want compromise. We don't want discussion. We don't want negotiation. We want our way or the highway. The rules, it seems, aren't binding upon the Senate Democrats. To them, the rules are living, breathing, evolving, and apparently optional. We shouldn't be surprised, though. We shouldn't be surprised that a party that believes in a living, breathing, ever-evolving, whatever you want it to be, Constitution, that they might not think the rules of the Senate are important. We shouldn't be surprised that the party that believes that morality is unfixed, unhinged, unchained to any constants, that all ethics are situation that this party might break the rules. We shouldn't be surprised. Is anyone really surprised that a party with no apparent concern for the burden of debt that they are placing on every American family, that such a party would break the rules to get their way? We are told that they are upset that the Senate just takes too long. They want their way and they want it now. They want their people nominated. They don't want to talk to the other side. They won the election. They want their way. So now they've bullied and brayed and they've won the day. The iron-fisted rule of the rule breakers has now begun. There will be no return. Are they going to return to the rules halfway, partway? No, I predict they will only go further. If they don't get their way, they don't get it quick enough, I predict they'll break the rules further. What passed for gridlock before this will pale in comparison to the poison that seeps from the hands of those who are careless and reckless with the law. Where the filibuster once created conversation, the iron-fisted rule of the rule breakers will stifle it. For you see, contrary to popular belief, the filibuster actually fostered compromise, dialogue, and often results. In exchange for the release of nominations, in exchange for the cooperation of the minority party with the majority party, often there was votes on legislation that not everybody wanted. There was discussion, there were amendments, there was dialogue, because we were forced to talk to each other because one side couldn't always get what they wanted. They couldn't slam their fist down in angry tantrum and say, my way or the highway, we want what we want. We don't care what 50% of America wants or what 47% of America wants. We want our way and we want it now. The tantrum used to not work, but now we will live in an era where the iron-fisted rule breakers will throw their tantrum and they will get whatever they want. Contrary to popular belief, the filibuster led to dialogue. Every week, the majority party talked to the minority party. There was a meeting each week in which the agenda for the week was set through dialogue and discussion and compromise. Behind the scenes, not always out in public, but there was discussion and compromise every week because the majority party could not rule with an iron fist. But now in the era of the iron fist, in the era of the iron-fisted rule breakers, why will there be any discussion? Why not just roll over the opposition? Why allow debate? Why have debate? Why have discussion? Why have dialogue? Why have votes? It's been getting less and less and less. As the grip gets tighter and tighter, there's less debate, there's less voting, there's less amendments. And I don't think the American public likes that. I think the American public disavows this place and is unhappy with Congress in general because of lack of dialogue. But that's where we're headed. We're headed towards less dialogue, not more. In the past, Republicans and Democrats would come together. They would agree to votes. They would schedule them for the week. They would agree to dialogue. They would agree to nominations. And they would agree to quick and easy votes for non-controversial nominees. But if there is to be no rules, what incentive is there for cooperation? If it's to be my way or the highway, if the majority party is simply to roll over, if they are to beat their fists, beat their iron fists upon the table and say, my way or the highway, we don't need you. We don't care that half the country disagrees with our policy. It's our way or the highway. If that's the way it's going to be, I think there'll be less dialogue and less compromise. Historically, the filibuster encouraged a reluctant president to cooperate with oversight from the Congress. This isn't a Republican or a Democrat thing. This is about the separation of powers. This is about the checks and balances to power. This is about a president who might say or not say whether or not he would kill Americans with a drone. This is about using the filibuster to get information from a reluctant president. This is about a filibuster that allowed Congress to get information to say and to force a president to say, I will not kill Americans with drones. This is about a reluctant president being asked, will you detain Americans? Can you put an American in jail without a trial? Can you send an American to Guantanamo Bay? How do we get those answers from a president who is reluctant to answer? Through the filibuster. The filibuster is an empowerment of Congress. It really isn't Republican versus Democrat. The filibuster is about Congress having power over the presidency or having power to counterbalance a presidency. Information about malfeasance or transparency can be pried from a president in exchange for nominations. Quite typically, holds on nominations were used to get information, were used to force people to testify. Recently, I had questions for the nominee for Homeland Security. I asked him, does the Fourth Amendment apply to third-party records? This is a big question. It's a big constitutional question. And there are answers. I might not have agreed with his answer. He said he had no opinion. He had no legal opinion on the Fourth Amendment. I asked him, can one warrant? Can one warrant from a secret court apply to all telephone records? Can every American who has their records with a phone company have their records looked at through one warrant? Is that consistent with the Fourth Amendment? And this nominee said, yeah, I really don't have an opinion on the Fourth Amendment. Really haven't thought that much about the Constitution. But he's going to lead one of the largest agencies in our government that may well have to do with spying on Americans, and yet has no opinion on the Fourth Amendment. So what would the filibuster do? Historically, the filibuster would stop his nomination. What would a hold do? Would it be petulant? Maybe at times, but for the most part, holds were placed on nominees that wouldn't answer questions. So if you wanted answers from nominees, you didn't want them to get up there and say, I don't recall 49 times, or I can't remember, or I don't have an opinion today, sir, on the Constitution, you would hold their nomination. You would hold their feet to the fire. The filibuster holds about slowing things down. This is about the separation of powers. This is about the checks and balances. Currently, we have a president who apparently thinks he's more than a president. He thinks he has a few monarchical powers. He believes more that he's a monarch than he is a president because he thinks he can amend legislation. 20 times, more than 20 times, Obamacare has been amended after the fact. They don't come back to Congress. So what would the filibuster do? What would a hold do? It would say to that president, you will obey the Constitution. We have no way really to get him in court on these things. It's very difficult to prove the constitutionality or disprove it by a challenge. But the beauty of our founding fathers was that they separated the power. So one of the powers of Congress is the filibuster. It is placing holds. And by doing that, we check a rebellious or an adventurous president, or a president who thinks he can take this power upon himself. Montesquieu, who was one of the people we looked to about the separation of powers, once wrote that when you allow the legislative power to gravitate to the president, when you allow the president to take this power and he can legislate or do whatever he wants, you're allowing a tyranny. That's why Montesquieu wrote that you had to separate these powers so no one body of people, no one grouping within government would assume or absorb too much power. That's what's happening here. By giving up our power for petty partisan reasons. Let's be really frank with each other. The Senate Democrats have, for petty partisan reasons, taken away the power of Congress, taken away one of the checks and balances on a rogue presidency. These checks and balances are not something that really we should stoop to the level of petty partisanship over. By allowing us to do so, what has happened is we've allowed ourselves to give up one of the great checks and balances that were one of the beauties of our Constitution. The loss of the filibuster, I think, truly weakens Congress, and it makes the executive, regardless of party, more powerful and less likely to be transparent, and really less likely to compromise. In short, when you give power to the party in the minority, when you have that power in the party that is in the minority, it works to coax compromise out of people. In the era of filibusters and holds, someone like myself, who's new to the Senate, could place a hold on the Federal Reserve Chairman and release it in exchange for a vote on auditing the Fed. Auditing the Fed passed 3 years ago in the House. It's a transparency bill. We should know what decisions happen. Congress created the Fed. People are getting personally wealthy off of the policies of the Fed. There's a revolving door between the Fed and the Treasury and the people who sell the Treasury bonds. There are Treasury secretaries who leave employment in government and make $160 million a year buying and selling the securities that are bought from a bank that we are not overseeing properly. There's all kinds of reasons why we should audit the Fed. Every Republican in the House voted for it. 100 Democrats voted for it. You rarely have a bill that 350 out of 435 representatives voted to audit the Fed. It's been over here for 3 years. It's been held hostage by the Senate majority. The only way the minority party ever gets any votes on anything is by using their leverage, by using the leverage of the filibuster, by using the leverage of a hold, I think often to get something good. There are a lot of things that need to be discussed that are never discussed in this body. Whether or not your phone calls, the records of your phone calls, the records of your email should be looked at by your government without a warrant, without an individualized warrant, is something that should have a debate here. We are, in the next week, supposed to go back on the defense authorization bill. The defense authorization bill in 2011 allowed for the first time in our history an American citizen to be held indefinitely. Allowed for the first time an American citizen to be sent from America to Guantanamo Bay and held in a foreign prison in a foreign land forever without charge, without trial, without lawyer, without accusation. When I had the debate on the floor with another senator over this in 2011, I said incredulously, "You mean an American citizen could be sent to Guantanamo Bay without a jury trial by a jury of their peers?" And he said, "Yeah, if they're dangerous." I said, it sort of begs the question, who gets to decide who's dangerous and who's not? Are these not questions we would want debated on the floor? A year ago, we voted to get rid of indefinite detention. 67 senators voted to get rid of indefinite detention. And then, secretly in conference committee, it was stripped out by a minority of 1 or 2 senators. So this year, we've been preparing for 6 months to have a vote on whether or not an American can be detained in prison without a trial. We'll get no vote because of the iron-fisted rule of the rule breakers. The rule breakers have decided no debate, no dialogue, no compromise, no discussion of questions till we tell you it's time. And it never seems to be time. You have to think about this because there have been times in our history when we have detained Americans unjustly. You have to think about how important a jury trial is for everyone, and you don't have to go far back in our history to see times when we made mistakes. You remember Richard Jewell, falsely accused, unfairly accused, wrongly accused of being a bomber, the Olympic bomber in Atlanta about a decade or so ago. If he'd have been a black man in 1920 in the South, he might not have survived the day. Fortunately, he lived in an era when we believed in a trial by jury, when we believed that no one should be detained without a trial by a jury. No one should be convicted and kept in prison without a trial. For goodness sakes, can there be anything more American than that? And yet the law of the land says that that's no longer true. Anybody in our society who ever thinks they've been treated unfairly, whether you're an African American or a Japanese American who can remember what happened to the Japanese Americans in World War II, should be horrified that your current law says that an individual, an American citizen, can be detained. Now, the president says, "I'm a good man and I'll never use it." He signs into law the authority for all presidents for all time to indefinitely detain American citizens without a trial, and yet he says, "Hey, I'm not going to do it." That's not a lot of comfort to those of us who believe in the law. I believe that the appropriateness or the ability for us to get to dialogue and discussion is important, that the American people want it, and the filibuster actually aided that. I think it forced us to have discussion. Without the discussion, without the filibuster, I don't think there'll be discussion. I don't think compromise will occur. It was infrequent before. I don't think it's going to occur without the threat of filibuster. The Senate will now be run with an iron fist, a fist clenched so tightly, a power wound so closely that dissent will no longer be heard. Debate will be stifled, and amendments to legislation will become non-existent. They're already rare. Washington described the Senate as the saucer that cools the tea that boils over from the cup of the House of Representatives. The Senate was that saucer that cooled the tea, deliberated, gave review, and time for calmer minds to prevail. The Senate was one of those items that our founders established to separate our republic from the whims of an unrestrained majority, from the headlong dash of an unrestrained mobocracy. I think the public will be burned more often as the Senate becomes less saucer and more boiling cauldron. The loss of the filibuster will lead to more enmity and less compromise. The death of the filibuster is the death of negotiation. Why negotiate if you don't have to? Through brute force and a disregard for the rule of law, Senate Democrats have found temporary victory, but at what cost? We will now become the other House of Representatives. Will debate and amendments become a thing of the past? Will an iron fist smash the saucer that once cooled the tea? Make no mistake about it, the death of the filibuster is the death of dialogue. All power taken from the minority power, all power that is taken from the minority party is a leverage that is taken from possible compromise. One day, I believe those who have seen fit to break the rules, to change the rules, will regret their actions. The question is, when cooler heads prevail, will there be anybody left with a spirit of compromise? All one has to do to see what happens when there is no debate, when there is no dialogue, when there is no compromise, all one has to do is look at the health care fiasco. It was passed without any discussion with Republicans, no input, zero input from Republicans. Why? Because at the time, even though we still had the filibuster, Senate Democrats were 60 and Republicans were 40. They didn't have to talk to us. When the majority party does not have to talk to the minority party, they won't. So with Obamacare, with the unaffordable health care plan that he's given us, there was no discussion, no debate. 60 Democrats, 40 Republicans. We got a bill that is completely and entirely their baby. No compromise. Same thing in the House. Passed by brute force by majority Democrats and no Republicans. So what we have now is something that is completely unworkable and doesn't represent the American people. I'll be the first to admit, we are divided. You know, not everybody's a Republican, not everybody's a Democrat, but the interesting thing is it's about 50-50. It's not 80-20. It isn't that everybody or the vast majority of the country want one way and another. It's almost 50-50. But instead of having 50-50 solutions come out of here, what's coming out of here is my way or the highway. It's interesting. You look back about a month ago when government was shut down, we were trying to open the government. Every day we tried to open the government, we said, what about just delaying Obamacare a little bit? What about delaying just the individual mandate? No way. We will not negotiate with a gun to our head, the president said. The president bellowed, I will not negotiate. You can't make me negotiate. I will not compromise. And immediately after the government opened back up, he did exactly the same thing we were asking for. He delayed the individual mandate. Of course, he did it unconstitutionally and illegally because he did it without the approval of Congress. That's the way it's been from the beginning. This is something that we as Americans should be extremely worried about. This is the stuff of kings. This is the stuff of monarchs, and this is the stuff of tyrants. Because he thinks that he can do the legislation by himself. But if there is no recourse to come back to Congress, what happens? Obamacare is a story of favoritism. It's a story of dispensing favorites to your contributors, your friends. Should we have a government where your campaign contribution buys you a different sort of scrutiny? It's no longer equal protection under the law. It's protection based on contribution history. So we've given waiver after waiver to special interest groups. You can see them with a big smile plastered on their face when they come out of the White House. There are special interest groups that have been to the White House hundreds of times. Meanwhile, the secretary in charge of putting up Obamacare and getting it started was there once, but hundreds of times special interests came. They paid first. They gave their campaign contributions. They paid. They got access to the White House, and they got a waiver. Why would McDonald's get a waiver and not Burger King? Why would one business get a waiver and not another? Why would a union business get a waiver and not another business that's not union? Is that equal protection under the law? Is that the way we're going to live? That's the way you will live if you allow all the power to gravitate to one person who has no checks and balances. That's why we're supposed to have a separation of powers. That's why we're supposed to live under a rule of law. Legislation is messy, and it takes a while. They no longer have the 60 votes to have his way or the highway. They can't get everything they want, and so they do it by executive fiat. But realize that an executive can dictate for good and for harm. Or does one person always know what's best for the country? So we've been dictated to all of these changes with Obamacare. But the bottom line is more people are now losing their health insurance than are gaining it. Those who are gaining it, those who have been forced into Obamacare, will recognize a few things. You are losing your freedom of choice, and you're being forced to pay more. So there are two things that are irrefutable about Obamacare. You have lost your freedom of choice. You are being dictated for plans. Where there were once hundreds of plans that you could purchase for insurance, there are four. Four plans left in America that you can choose from. And they're more expensive. Why? Because you're told that your kids have to have dental coverage, pediatric dental coverage. What if you don't have any kids? You're being told you have to have infertility coverage. What if you're not married? You're told you have to have pregnancy coverage. What if you're not married? The thing is what's been outlawed are cheaper insurance policies. So let's think back to the original problem. 85% of America had health insurance, right? 15% of Americans didn't. Of the 15% who didn't have health insurance, a third of them were eligible for Medicaid, and we could have helped them by fixing some eligibility with Medicaid. We're actually trying to help people understand how to sign up. A third of the 15% that were uninsured, some reports said were not here in the country legally. And then a third of the 15% made between $50,000 and $75,000 a year, but they weren't buying insurance because they were young and healthy and they decided to roll the dice, and because they perceived health insurance as being too expensive. So the main impediment to the body of people who we could have gotten insured was expense. So what have we done to help them? We've made health insurance more expensive for them. So if you're young and healthy, you should want a high deductible with very few mandates that's very cheap. So what does Obamacare give you? It gives you a very high deductible that covers 1,000,001 things you don't need or don't want, and it's very expensive. So really what we have done here is we've taken away freedom of choice, and we've given you something you don't want and made it more expensive. This is the danger of having one-sided, one-party rule. There is no debate, no discussion, and that's what happened with Obamacare. A lopsided result, a misbegotten legislation that doesn't work, can't work, and is leading to disaster. Now, some have said, how could we fix it? Can we make Obamacare less bad? I'm not positive you can, because some are saying, well, and this is what the president finally did. The president finally came back unilaterally and said, well, yeah, okay, I'll give you another year. So look at it from the perspective now of the insurance company. They can offer the cheaper policies for one more year. What incentive do they have? You're being told that within a year you got to buy more expensive insurance. Does the insurance company have any incentive to sell insurance that's less expensive again? If you're mandated to buy something more expensive, why would they offer something less expensive? So now everybody in the country is going to be forced to buy something more expensive. But many young people are going to look at this and say, well, you know, it's more expensive and the penalty's not that bad for my income. Maybe I'd be better off not having insurance. Besides, now I can buy it anytime when I get sick. So there is no incentive to buy health insurance when you're healthy now, other than the penalty. Many people may say, I'll just wait till I've got chest pain, I'm rolling in the emergency room, or until I get in an auto accident, then I'll buy my insurance. But make no mistake about this. This is about choice versus coercion. So we have one party that has decided that they know best They know what's best for you. They feel that you're not smart enough to take care of yourself. They feel that they should be, in a benevolent way, your parents. So you have a party that's decided they will take care of you from cradle to grave. But don't worry, it's free. No big deal, it's free. We're going to give you free health care. Well, mark my words, there's nothing free about this. You will pay for this. If you had insurance before, you will pay for this with more expensive insurance premiums. If you didn't have insurance before, you will pay for this with more expensive insurance than you could have bought before this. The question is, how do you make it work? It only works now, if it's going to work at all, through coercion. You are forced to buy something. To me, that's antithetical with what the American Republic was founded upon. We're founded upon freedom of choice. You make freedom of choice every day in the things you purchase. Why is the one thing that you're not allowed would be your health insurance? No one's allowed to have the freedom of choosing what type of health insurance they buy. But realize what this stems from. This stems from allowing government to get so completely in one hands that there is no check and balance. So there are checks and balances between the branches of government, and there are checks and balances between the parties. So you've let one party get too strong of a hold in Congress, you will get something that is not the product of compromise, not the product of discussion. But also, if you weaken the body of the Senate, which was intended to slow down legislation, if you weaken that body by taking away the ability to filibuster or to place holds on nominees, once you do that, you're going to get away from compromise. So I think it's important that people know when they look at this and they say, well, that's just obstruction. Republicans, filibusters and holds, that's just obstructing the process. If the process is to run headlong away from the Constitution, or to run head over heels over the Bill of Rights, to trample the Bill of Rights, if that's the direction you're heading, you would want things to cool off. You would want that saucer that the Senate was that allowed the tea not to boil over, or to boil over to cool off. So the question really we have is, do we want checks and balances? And this is a big question. We've gotten to the point in our history where so much power has gravitated to the president. Not just this president, Republican presidents also. This is not a 4 or an 8-year evolution. This is a 100-year evolution towards a stronger presidency. We've now allowed presidents to go to war without congressional authority. We've allowed them to trample over civil liberties without congressional authority. We now allow regulatory regimes to write so many rules that your elected officials have very little say over what laws you live under. For example, Obamacare we complained about was 2,000 pages. The Democrat leader in the House of Representatives says, oh, don't worry, you can read about it after we pass it. That is a mistake, and that's why we got this, that many people still aren't understanding this piece of legislation. But top it off, you had a 2,000-page legislation that then 20,000 pages of rules were written. Unelected bureaucrats are writing most of the rules. So, for example, when Obamacare passed, believe it or not, I think the original legislation would have let you keep your doctor, period. A regulation written 3 months after the bill was passed changed it and said, you can keep your doctor, but you have to pay more, and it has to obey this rule. And, well, let's just say you can maybe keep your doctor if President Obama likes your doctor. But this was a rule written not by Congress. It wasn't part of the legislation. This is a rule written afterwards. So about 3 months later, as they're writing 20,000 pages of rules, a rule comes up and says, if your insurance ever changes, it's not grandfathered in and you will lose your insurance. It will be canceled. You will be forced to be canceled. So the millions of people who are having their insurance canceled, it's because the president authorized this through his bureaucracy without the permission of the Senate. However, it gets more interesting. Occasionally, when a regulation is passed, we can try to stop it. So 3 months after Obamacare was passed, they passed this regulation that says you will be canceled. Millions of people were being canceled because President Obama and his team wrote this regulation. One Republican senator, Senator Enzi from Wyoming, stood up and said, no, we will vote on this. We will vote on whether or not your policy can be canceled. And so what happened? It came back, and guess what? The regulation that says your policy can be canceled if it ever changes, the regulation that's allowing millions of people to be canceled, every Democrat in the body voted for it, including a few of them who are running headlong away from the president. They can't get away from the president as they can't get away from him fast enough. So they're running headlong away from the president saying, oh, I didn't know that that rule was going to be there. I really thought you could keep your doctor. Bunk. They all knew it. They all voted directly on it. Not only did they vote for Obamacare, 3 months later, they voted for the rule that is allowing millions of people to have their insurance canceled. So these senators who are saying, oh, Mr. President, we might need to fix this, and I have a solution, they all voted for the rule. We had a direct vote in the Senate on the rule that says, if you like your doctor, you can't keep your doctor. So the whole idea that the president said, if you like your doctor, you can keep it, period, which is now found out to be false, we had a chance to fix it. We had a vote in this body. Every Senate Democrat voted to allow your insurance to be canceled. So if you're one of the millions of Americans who've had your insurance canceled, you can thank the Senate Democrats. Every Senate Republican voted to say you shouldn't have your insurance canceled. Every Senate Democrat voted to allow your insurance to be canceled if it ever changes. Ever changes. So while some people have been wondering how many people are going to lose their insurance because of Obamacare, everyone, because insurance changes gradually over time. So within a few years, everybody's insurance policy will change and you will be canceled. Everyone in America will lose their insurance. They will be canceled eventually, and they will have to buy Obamacare. So people had hundreds and hundreds of choices for insurance. There will be 4 choices in America. So really what this debate is about, it's about whether you believe in freedom of choice, whether you think you're smart enough to rule over your own destiny, or whether you want a paternalistic government that makes these decisions for you. Are we so insecure as a people that we need the nanny state? Do we need the nanny state to take care of us? Do we not want choice? Why don't we extend it to all things? Healthcare is important, but so is food. Why don't we have the government decide what type of food you eat? Why don't we just have the government decide how much you can charge? God forbid that we charge too much for food. Shouldn't food be cheap and economical and affordable? Maybe the government should own the farms. Maybe the government should distribute the food. If the government's going to distribute health care, and health care is so important, so's food, so's water, how could we let anybody in the private marketplace determine water? How could we let private people control water? Shouldn't we let the government be in charge of everything? The bottom line is we shouldn't let the government be in charge of anything that can't be handled by the private marketplace, which means very little should be handled by the government. The reason why you want minimal government is that government's just not very good at stuff. I tell people it's not that government is inherently stupid, although it's a debatable point. It's that government doesn't get the same signals that we get. In the private marketplace, you get signals. You have to make a profit. You have to meet a payroll. So there are different signals that come. To healthcare, if the government runs, there is no signal. They get no feedback. So right now they have a website that would have sent any private business into bankruptcy. This would have been a failed initiation, and the company would have immediately gone bankrupt. No company could roll out something as bad as a government, but no private company would, because a private company is influenced by the marketplace and they have to make good decisions. The government doesn't make good decisions because they're not required to. And so it's why when you have a choice whether or not something should be done by government or done by private marketplace, you want the private marketplace. Milton Friedman often talked about this. This is a truism of all government. Nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as they spend their own. So the private marketplace inevitably will make better decisions because it's a cruel master. The marketplace, you have to please consumers all the time, every day. They vote. You've heard the term democratic capitalism. There's nothing more democratic than consumers and capitalism voting every day, and the people who are rewarded are those who give a product that people want to buy, and they do it in an efficient manner. So people are forced to be efficient. They're forced to have good consumer service. The consumer is king only in the private marketplace. The consumer is treated as a stepchild if it's government. You are treated with reckless abandon by government. I know as a physician, I dealt with the government for decades and decades, and you know what? It takes at least an hour to get someone on the phone. When you get them on the phone, they tell you can only answer 2 questions. If they're not in a good mood, you got to call again. Get on the phone for an hour and wait another hour to talk to another government bureaucrat who may be surly, may have had a bad day, and probably will get a bonus anyway. Think about, if you want government to take over your health care, think about the case of Jonathan Beale. Okay, he worked for the EPA for 11 years. He told his boss that he was a spy and that he worked for the CIA. He took 6 months off at a time for years and years. He always got bonuses for good employment, for good behavior, for good productivity for 11 years. This is what goes on in government because they have would that happen for a week or 2 weeks in a private industry? No way would that happen. Government is so big and vast, they have no idea who else is even working in government. And we're going to turn that over our healthcare system. The bottom line is it won't be efficient. It won't try to save money. It'll try to spend money. And it won't lead to you having lower premiums. It'll lead to having higher premiums. Thomas Paine said that government is a necessary evil. He was right. That sounds kind of harsh, but the thing is we need to have government, but because government's inefficient, we should keep what government does to a minimum. There's certain things we probably can't have private industry do. A national defense, an army, a navy, an air force. Government needs to be in place for that. We've decided with most of our infrastructure to have government involved. We have some private entities involved as well. But do we really want government involved in every one of our affairs? Do we really think government is going to be distributing goods very well? Think of it this way. Think of it, tomorrow we nationalize grocery shopping. We nationalize and you all get insurance and it's going to be subsidized. When you go to Walmart, you'll just pay a $20 copay. Do you think you'll buy less or more there? You'll empty the shelves. The other day you may have heard the food stamp cards quit working and they didn't have any limits. People just loaded up thousands and thousands of dollars worth of stuff, trashed the whole place, carts were everywhere, and then someone turned the cards back on and the limits were there and they had to leave the store. When there are no limits, people will spend without limits. Same goes with health care. So the thing is, when government does it and gives it to you for free, the tendency is to use it. So what we find is that, for example, with Medicaid, a big part of Obamacare is the expansion of Medicaid. I want to help people who can't help themselves. There are a lot of people who are missing both legs and on dialysis and they're $10,000 a month insurance. I think we can find a way to help these people. But we've now added able-bodied people to this. We've now added generation after generation of able-bodied people to the Medicaid rolls. So instead of a temporary hand up, a helping hand, we've turned it into something permanent. But it's also the most rapidly rising cost in state governments. So state governments, I believe, will ultimately succumb to this burden. In our state, it'll be a 50% increase in Medicaid. In fact, most of the people signing up around the country, 3/4 of them in my state are signing up for free health care. It's not really free. You're going to pay for it. Anybody that's working will pay for it. But the thing is, that's what they're signing up for is free. I think that if we expand our safety net beyond sort of those who are not able-bodied, and we expand it and make it permanent for people, what it becomes is a drag on the economy and a drag on everything, and it disallows or prevents us from growing as an economy. We've been having this debate for a while. The president has decided that people who are working just have too much money, and I've got to take from those who are working to give to those who aren't working. That's not how you get more jobs. That's how you make the pie smaller. You keep dividing up a pie and shifting the pie from those working to those non-working. Doesn't really help anybody. It divides the pie smaller. There have been times in our history, though, when we have really greatly grown the pie. But you have to get beyond some petty things. The president preaches fear and envy. He preaches class warfare. He preaches that if your neighbor has 3 cars, send me, I'll take one of their cars. I'll get some of your neighbor's stuff and I'll give it to you. The problem is it doesn't make us richer as a nation. What makes there has been a discussion for thousands of years about whether it's good or bad to spend your time coveting your neighbor's property. It isn't healthy personally, spiritually, but it's not also healthy for a country. Really what you need to, the thing is, if I labor my whole day saying, my neighbor's got a Mercedes and I don't, I should be instead saying, maybe my son or daughter will be working at the Mercedes dealer, selling it to somebody who's buying a Mercedes. Instead of being jealous and envious of others, I should be saying that we're all interconnected and that we want more people to rise up and be one of the top 1%. Instead of taking a meat axe to those who are successful in our society and trying to drive them down, we should try to raise everybody's boat. There have been many histories when many times when this has happened. In the 1920s, Coolidge took the top rate from 70% down to 23%. We had a boom. Employment thrived. He balanced the budget. We did it again under Kennedy in the 60s. Unemployment was once again cut in half. By the time we get to Reagan, the rates have risen to 70% again. And Reagan said, our economy will boom if we lower rates on everybody. And he did. He lowered rates from 70% at the top rate, the top 1%. He lowered their rates. He didn't raise their rates. He didn't say, covet thy neighbor. He didn't say, I'll get you one of your neighbor's cars. He said, lower the rates and the economy will boom, and it did. We lowered the rates from 70 on the wealthy to 50 to 28, and we had a decade-long boom with millions of jobs created. We have to have this debate as a country. We can't say the debate's over. If we say the debate is over and that really what we need to do is just divide it up, pass the money around, we're going to be talking about a shrinking pie that we pass around. We also have a pie right now that has millions of people unemployed. So how are we going to grow as an economy? Are we going to grow as an economy by saying let's tax people more? It's exactly the opposite. I was in Detroit last week talking about how we could help Detroit. We can't send money from Houston to Detroit and bail them out. Doesn't work. One, because it's just like when the president did his government stimulus. When the president chose to pick winners and losers, he wound up with a bunch of losers. Because no central planner knows who's going to be the winner and who's going to be the loser. 9 out of 10 businesses fail. That's why you don't want government choosing the winners and losers. So when government chooses the winners and losers, they choose people like Solyndra. One, it was a little bit unfair on the face of it. The guy who ran the company was the 20th richest man in the country. What business do the middle class, which the president says he's so proud of, what business does the middle class having given money to the 20th richest man in the world? Well, he lost $500 million because it turns out people didn't want his solar panels. But that's the government picking winners and losers, many times based on campaign history and based on, environmental politics. But it's picking winners and losers, and it doesn't work. Why? Because the marketplace, when it winnows out and finds who will be successful running a business, is a harsh taskmaster, but it asks all of you. It asks 300 million Americans every day to vote on which businesses will succeed. And so you get to vote every day. So there's a big difference between reducing taxes for those who are in business and trying to stimulate the economy and taxing people in Houston, bringing it up here, and then passing it out to people I think might be good at business in Detroit. No one knows that. No one has that knowledge. Only the marketplace can decide who's a good risk and who's a bad risk. Banks are part of that, but really the consumer votes every day on which businesses are good and should receive more money. So my plan is basically economic freedom zones. Let's lower the taxes in impoverished areas. Let's don't tax Houston and bring a bunch of money up to Detroit and say, here, you're going to succeed. The same thing will happen to that money that happened to the last 50 years of money. Some of it's stolen, some of it's misappropriated, some of it's given to the wrong people. But if you were to lower the taxes for the people in Detroit, I think you could truly help them. My plan would lower the personal income tax to 5% for everybody in Detroit. It would lower the corporate tax to 5%. You might find people in the suburbs want to move back into Detroit if their income tax is 5%. That's a good thing. They would pay less taxes. So instead of being envious of these people, instead of saying, oh my goodness, they might buy another car, I'll be saying they might buy that car from somebody selling a car in Detroit. The thing is that economic freedom zones, reducing taxes, I think would help to spur the economy. In my state, there are 20 counties in eastern Kentucky that have unemployment 1.5 times the national rate. Now, a large degree of our unemployment is due to the president and his war on coal. He always talks about a balanced solution, but he doesn't really balance his hatred for the coal industry with jobs. He doesn't balance his so-called like for the environment with jobs. When we look at regulations, we should preserve the environment, and we have many federal regulations that I do agree with on the environment. You shouldn't be allowed to dump chemicals in a stream. I agree completely with that. Clean Water Act says cannot discharge pollutants into the navigable waters of the United States. I agree completely. But you know what they've done over the last 30 years? They've taken that common sense regulation, which we can probably all agree to, and they now say that dirt is a pollutant and your backyard's a navigable stream. So we have actually put people in prison for putting clean dirt on dry land. And as a consequence, I think we spend less time protecting the Ohio River and more time meddling with some property owner. We've gone crazy with regulations because they're now written by unelected bureaucrats. They're not written by people you can unelect. They're written by bureaucrats. We have to get back to some common sense with these things. We have to look at how injurious this is. Even things that are well-intended. You think, well, gosh, we have to protect the bald eagle and we have to have endangered species protected. Well, I agree. I've got 2 bald eagles in my backyard. They've come for the 2nd year and they're fascinating. They live on the other side of a pond behind my house, and they're fascinating to see them. But what we've done is protection for the environment and protection for certain species. We've gone nuts with it. In my state, we're protecting the Indiana bat. Well, I had a guy come up to me and he said, the Indiana bat? Well, they came out to my property and they took a survey and they found 1 bat. It was already tagged as a brown bat. The scientists had a big fight. 2 of them said it was an Indiana bat and 1 said it was a brown bat. They took the tag off of it, called it an Indiana bat, but did they tell me I had to do anything to help the bat? No, they just charged me money to cut down trees on my own land. So it really isn't about the bat, it's about money. They charge you $2,400 per acre to chop your own trees down. Another city in my state, Grand Rivers, when it rained, the sewage was flowing into the river, overflowing. They were over capacity. They wanted to have a new sewage plant. They couldn't do it because the EPA was saying, we need to know how many pocketbook mussels there are. Now, are we going to stop the building of the plant? No. What it does is it causes hundreds of thousands of dollars to be spent looking at this. Bottom line is, remember, separation of powers is important, and the loss of the filibuster, I think, is leading towards a one-sided party rule and leading towards less power here and more power in the executive branch, I think all to the detriment of the voter. At this point, I see my colleague from Ohio and Oklahoma, and I will yield my time back to the